Lakewood had always been a quiet town, as if frozen in time. It was hidden in the green hills, surrounded by forests and lakes, far from the bustle of the big cities. There were seldom events that could disturb its inhabitants. The town was known for its cozy streets, well-tended gardens at every house, and the constant sense of calm that enveloped it like a warm blanket. Everyone knew their neighbors, and news didn't spread through the internet or newspapers, but mostly through conversations at the bakery or on morning walks through the park. One of Lakewood's main symbols was its old library, the Lakewood Public Library, located downtown on Fox Street. The ivy-covered red brick building stood out for its Victorian architecture and stately facade that preserved the spirit of a bygone era. Inside there was a cozy atmosphere, old wooden shelves, high ceilings, elegant chandeliers with warm light. Here every visitor could find something to his taste, whether it was dusty folios, historical novels, modern detectives, or fresh magazines. The Lakewood Library had long been more than just a place to read books. It was a kind of social center where citizens gathered not only to find a new book, but also to meet, discuss the latest news, share stories, and just have a good time. There were lectures, literary evenings, crafts classes, and even book club meetings led by the energetic and restless Mrs. Evelyn Petty, a librarian of many years' standing. Mrs. Petty was the soul of the library. Everyone knew her, from the little ones who came with their parents to get their first books to the elderly residents who sat in the reading room for hours reading newspapers. She was tall, slender, with short gray hair, and in her invariable glasses with thin gold frames, she radiated warmth and care. She was calm and thoughtful, and had an incredible love of books. She could tell the story of any book on the shelf, help select the right volume, and even offer a tea party for those who wanted to discuss the next book they had read. One early autumn morning, Mrs. Petty was the first to arrive at the library as usual. The sun was just rising over the town, coloring the sky with pink and orange hues. In silence, interrupted only by the rustling of fallen leaves, she unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside, breathing in the smell of old books and wood. The day boded to be quiet. There weren't many readers at this time, and she had plenty of time to get to work relisting old books in the archives, a task that required patience and attention, but one she loved. She loved flipping through the pages of forgotten books, each one holding its own secrets. The archive was located in the far corner of the library, behind heavy oak doors. It was a place where old and seldom used books were kept, those that had long since fallen out of fashion or no longer attracted the attention of readers. The large shelves of dusty volumes had not been moved for years, and today Mrs. Petty decided to put them in order. She methodically took the books off the shelves, checked their condition, made notes in a journal, and put them back. One of the books, old and badly darkened by time, caught her eye. The heavy leather-bound volume, with gold embossing on the cover, didn't look familiar. Mrs. Petty carefully removed the book from the shelf, feeling the heaviness of the binding resting pleasantly in her hands. It was an old book on cryptography, a science that few people in Lakewood were interested in now. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with time, and it looked as if no one had opened it in decades. Mrs. Petty opened the book with curiosity, and as she leafed through the pages, she noticed something strange. There was a folded piece of paper between the pages. She unfolded the paper and felt a shiver run through her. The paper was old, with jagged edges and noticeably darkened, but what was stranger was that it had a set of numbers and symbols on it that looked completely meaningless. The numbers and letters seemed to be scattered at random, without any apparent order. Mrs. Petty tried to read on, hoping to find some clue, but the text seemed to her absolutely incomprehensible. But there was a sense of uneasiness in her, something in the message that made her uneasy. This was no mere joke. A strange uneasiness crept into her heart. She resolutely folded the paper back, and without thinking any further, decided to call the police. Thus began a story that changed Lakewood's quiet life forever. Mrs. Petty stood in the semi-dark archive room of the library, holding an old, barely intact paper. She reread the set of numbers and symbols several times, but the more she gazed into the strange text, the more a sense of unease gripped her. The lines seemed to have a life of their own, cold and impenetrable. This was not a simple note. casually forgotten among the pages of an ancient book. It was not something to be easily ignored. Only one question throbbed in Mrs. Petty's mind: who had left this message and why? The paper on which the message was written looked ancient. It was thin, almost transparent in places, with a rough edge as if it had been carelessly torn from an old notebook or document. The paper had turned yellowish-brown from time, and there were thin cracks running through it. It gave the message a sense of perhaps importance. At first glance it looked like a random collection of signs, but there was something about the symbols that held a hidden meaning that Mrs. Petty could not unravel. The message consisted of several lines of alternating numbers and symbols, with occasional Latin letters, but all in a chaotic order. The words did not form logical phrases. The numbers did not form any visible connections. It was a code, but what kind of code? The longer Mrs. Petty gazed into the symbols, the stronger was her feeling that this message might conceal something truly dangerous. Her thoughts scattered in all directions. Could it be just a mistake? Had someone forgotten their entries in the book? But why did it look so much like a cipher? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became to her that there was more to it than that. The librarian couldn't say exactly what was bothering her, but her intuition, which had rarely failed her over the years, told her she needed to act. She took another look at the book in which she had found the message. The old volume on cryptography was long forgotten on the back shelf of the archives. No one in Lakewood, as far as she could recall, had picked it up in recent years. Why would anyone leave a note in that book? Could it have been accidental? Or, on the contrary, had someone purposely hidden it here, knowing that the book would rarely be opened? Evelyn Petty closed the book and headed for her desk in the main room of the library. She could feel her hands trembling slightly with excitement, though she tried to keep outwardly calm. The library was still as quiet as ever. Only the faint rustling of pages and the occasional creak of a chair broke the silence. An ordinary day that was suddenly filled with a sense of something sinister. When Mrs. Petty reached her desk, she did not ponder further. She knew it was her duty to report the discovery. The suspicious message must not go unheeded. She went to the old telephone on her desk and dialed the number of the local police station. A few minutes later, the familiar voice of the duty officer picked up the receiver. Mrs. Petty calmly, though with a little inner uneasiness, told him of the discovery. She described the message and her suspicions that it might be encrypted information, possibly related to some crime. The officer listened to her carefully and promised to turn the case over to a detective. After another half hour, a tall man in a gray trench coat appeared at the library door. It was Detective Ben Johnson. His calm and confident manner impressed Mrs. Petty at once. He was a man who was clearly used to dealing with the most complicated and intricate cases. Johnson was known for his analytical mind and extraordinary intuition. During his years on the police force, he had earned a reputation for seeing details that eluded the eyes of others. The detective entered the library, looking around as if assessing the surroundings. He listened intently to Mrs. Petty as she talked about her find, and then asked to see the book and note. Was this found in a book on cryptography? Johnson asked, raising an eyebrow. Curious, very curious. He carefully took the paper from Mrs. Petty's hands and took a long look at the set of symbols. Johnson was an experienced detective, and he was not easily surprised, but this message had clearly caught his attention. It doesn't look like something random, he said quietly, speaking more to himself than to Mrs. Petty. It does seem to be a cipher. The question is, who left it and why? He stepped back to the large table, spread the paper before him, and began to study it more carefully. He knew that such codes had often been used in the past to transmit secret messages, and although modern criminals rarely resorted to such methods, Johnson could not ignore the possibility that something serious was behind this note. "I'll look into it, Mrs. Petty," he said confidently, rising from his chair. "Thank you for your attentiveness. If it is indeed a cipher, it may indicate something important. But don't worry for now. We'll get it under control." Mrs. Petty was somewhat relieved to see how the detective felt about her find. She wasn't paranoid, but her intuition told her it was more than just a forgotten note. It was in the hands of the police now, and she hoped Ben Johnson would solve the mystery. Detective Ben Johnson entered the office of the Lakewood Police Station with a sense of slight tension. His usual calm had been slightly disturbed after his morning visit to the library. The message he had found stirred his thoughts, bringing to mind instances where small details, seemingly meaningless at first glance, turned out to be the key to solving big crimes. Johnson had been a police officer for over 15 years. He has come a long way from a simple patrolman to one of the top detectives in the investigations division. Over the years, he had to deal with a variety of cases, from domestic conflicts to serious crimes, sometimes involving blackmail, murder, and fraud. But Ben differed from many others in that he was truly fascinated by the most mysterious and difficult cases, those that seemed completely inexplicable at first glance. Ben Johnson was a middle-aged man with a lean build and a penetrating gaze that concealed a sharp mind. His short, dark hair was beginning to thin at the temples, and under his eyes there were occasional circles from lack of sleep, but these small details only emphasized his dedication. Johnson lived and breathed investigations. He was a man who would not rest until he had completed a case. With no family or children, he spent his evenings and weekends in the office or at crime scenes, solving puzzles and unraveling intricate schemes. Surrounded by colleagues who respected him for his incredible insight and attention to detail, Ben was a somewhat aloof man. He rarely shared personal experiences, and none of his coworkers knew that he was dealing with the demons of his past alone, a difficult divorce and the loss of a close friend who died on assignment several years ago. These events left a deep mark on the detective's soul, causing him to become even more withdrawn from his work. Johnson avoided unnecessary conversations and behaved with restraint, but when it came to investigations, he turned into a man who noticed every detail, every tiny fragment of the puzzle. Upon receiving the message from Mrs. Petty and examining the encrypted message, Johnson knew at once that this was no mere chance find. He saw it as more than just a set of symbols forgotten in a book. To a seasoned detective who was used to such details, ciphers were always a warning of something more. They could hold clues to planned crimes, especially when found in places like libraries or old archives, where information was often kept secret from the past. Ben settled at his desk in his office, where a soft light burned in the corner of the lamp, reflecting off stacks of files and file folders. He placed the found message in front of him, pulled out a notepad, and began taking notes. His methodical nature had always set him apart from other detectives. He could spend hours or even days studying a single detail until he found a clue, and it always came to fruition. Examining the encrypted note, Ben remembered several old cases involving ciphers and codes. He had encountered similar symbols earlier in his career, and it had always led to the unraveling of more complex conspiracies. Often criminals used ciphers to hide their intentions from the uninitiated, but to Johnson, such codes were a challenge. He knew that if he unraveled this cipher, something more serious would be revealed behind it. He ran his fingers over the paper, scrutinizing its texture. It was very old paper, its roughness and stains suggesting that it had been in the book for years, hidden from view. That in itself was suspicious. But what caught the detective's attention the most was the combination of symbols. They didn't look like a simple code that could be deciphered by normal means. There was something complex here, something that required deeper work. Interesting, he muttered to himself, stroking his chin. These numbers and letters could be related to the book's code or to a certain encryption algorithm. Perhaps it's an ancient method. Johnson knew that in the past, such codes had been used by spies and secret agents to transmit important information. And the book in which the message had been found, an old 19th century work on cryptography, only reinforced his suspicions. He remembered that such codes had been used extensively during wars and in international intelligence operations. But why was such a message here, in the library of a quiet town? The detective's brain kicked into full gear. He knew every detail mattered. Had someone left this message deliberately, knowing it would be found, or vice versa, hoping it would never be discovered? And if it was found by accident, it could have been a warning. The only question was, a warning of what? Johnson decided to start with the basics. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for old coding methods that might match the structure of the message he'd found. But he needed more information, something that could shed light on this code. He decided that he needed to take another look through the book and the library archives. Perhaps there would be additional clues there. Besides, it was necessary to talk to Mrs. Petty. The librarian might have accidentally missed something, but her intuition had already played a key role in this case, and she could help him even more. Johnson became more and more convinced by the hour that this message was connected to the impending crime. He could feel it in his gut. Someone might be trying to set up something serious, and this message was his last chance to prevent trouble. But he had too little time. The cipher had to be solved as quickly as possible, and it depended on how fast he could act. The detective rose slowly from his chair, took his coat and the note, folding it carefully into an envelope. He knew that every action he took from now on was important, and he was ready to reveal the secret because every hour could bring the city closer to something dangerous. Chains of logical reasoning were already beginning to line up in his head, but there was one thing he couldn't get out of his mind: who could be behind this message and why choose Lakewood? With that question in mind, Ben headed back to the library, ready to search further. There was a tension in his soul that foreshadowed the daunting task ahead of him. Ben Johnson returned to the library with a firm determination in his eyes. He sensed that this case would be much deeper than it seemed at first glance. A gusty wind from the street pushed open the library doors as the detective stepped inside, as if to emphasize the seriousness of what was going on. Mrs. Petty, standing behind the counter with her usual good-natured smile, noticed his tense face at once and knew that the investigation had begun. "Mrs. Petty," Johnson began, approaching the counter, "I want to take another look at that book. I think it might give us some more information that have left the encrypted message." "Of course, detective," the librarian replied, heading straight for the archives. "I saved it for you, as you requested. It's surprisingly old. No one's been interested in it for years." Ben followed Mrs. Petty closely, thinking over everything he already knew. A book on cryptography published in the 19th century is not a random choice for someone who wants to leave an encrypted message. The man who hid the note clearly knew his business. But who was this man? And why had he chosen Lakewood? These questions kept the detective in suspense. Mrs. Petty carefully pulled a book from the shelf. It was a small volume, but it looked to be over 100 years old. The worn leather of the cover, the faded pages, and the slightly yellowed edges gave away its age. On the spine of the book was visible inscription: "The Art of Cryptography. Theories and Methods, 1887 edition." Johnson picked it up gently, feeling the fragility of the binding beneath his fingers. "It's quite a rare book," Mrs. Petty said, glancing at the detective. "It's been in our collection almost as long as the library itself has existed. As far as I can remember, no one has taken it, at least not in decades." "No one?" Ben asked, raising an eyebrow in interest. "Well, at least not according to official records. Maybe someone just quietly returned it to the shelf without registering the borrowing," the librarian sighed. The detective realized that it was entirely possible. Books in the library often passed through the hands of different people, and not everyone kept a close eye on their movements. Nevertheless, someone had clearly deliberately hidden an encrypted message in this particular book. Ben opened the book and flipped through its pages. Carefully examining each one, he tried to find any notes or markings that might indicate something more than just the accidental presence of encrypted paper. The pages of the book were filled with theoretical musings on the various encryption methods used in different eras. The book covered a wide range of methods, from Caesar's simplest ciphers, where letters were simply shifted a few positions, to more complex encryption systems used for military purposes. Johnson had learned of many of these methods early in his career, and they often surfaced in investigations involving fraud or espionage. But what was in front of him now made him wonder if the man who had left the message was a true master of his craft. One section of the book was a chapter on World War I ciphers. It described the use of books as key elements of encryption. During the war, books were often used to create so-called book ciphers, where page, line, and word numbers represented the encrypted message. This seemed particularly interesting. The detective began to suspect that the cipher in front of him was just such a cipher. He went back to the message Mrs. Petty had found and looked at it carefully once more. Now armed with the knowledge of the book, he began to notice certain patterns. The numbers in the message might have indicated pages, lines, and words in a particular book. This meant that the text of the message itself might have been hidden in the book he was working with. Mrs. Petty, has this book ever been used in any of your social events or lectures? Ben asked, turning the pages. No, this book is too specific for most of our readers. We're more geared toward fiction and history, and cryptography is a topic for a narrow range of people. As far as I know, no one has been interested in it for years, she replied. That only made Ben more suspicious. If this book hadn't attracted attention in recent years, why exactly was it the place for an encrypted message? The detective deepened his thoughts once more. The answer to that question could be a clue. Ben decided to examine the message through the lens of historical encryption methods. He began by looking for possible connections between the numbers and letters in the message and the chapters of the book. His first step was to identify whether the note's author used one of the classic encryption methods, perhaps the Vigenère cipher, where letters are substituted depending on the key chosen, or a more complex system. Johnson took a notebook and began writing out the symbols from the message, matching them with possible variants of ciphers. It became clear to him that this was not just a random collection of numbers and symbols, it was a carefully planned message. The numbers were clearly pointing to something specific, perhaps pages and lines, and the symbols might have been part of a more complex code. It looks like these numbers and letters are the key to something more important, he muttered to himself as he continued taking notes. Johnson spent several hours studying the methods in the book, matching them to the contents of the note. He methodically tested different variations of the cipher, weeding out those that didn't fit the structure. But soon an idea occurred to him. If the person who had left the note had used an old encryption method, then perhaps the key to the cipher itself was hidden not in a single text, but in an entire system tied to specific knowledge of 19th century cryptography. Detective Ben Johnson sat at his desk in the police station again, surrounded by old catalogs and documents from the Lakewood Library. The soft light of the lamp fell on the encrypted message that lay on the desk in front of him, as if inviting him to reveal its secrets. Ben took a deep breath, feeling a growing excitement. He knew that somewhere in here, among these pages and numbers, was hidden a clue, and perhaps a warning of a crime to come. After carefully analyzing the cryptography book and his own conclusions from the cipher he had found, Johnson was certain that what he had in front of him was a coding technique used during the First World War. He had read about it in a book. This method of encryption was based on arranging books on a shelf and using the titles as the key. It was not only the content that mattered, but also the order in which the books were arranged. Depending on which books were chosen, the encrypted message could change, as could the meaning of the message. The detective took the note in his hands once more and scrutinized it carefully. The set of numbers and symbols on the paper now looked more meaningful. The numbers could point to pages and lines in certain books, and the symbols could point to letters in those lines. It all came down to one thing. He needed to find the correct order of the books that was used for encryption. But to do that, he had to determine exactly which books were important to that code. Johnson recalled his early conversations with Mrs. Petty. She had mentioned that the cryptography book had not been in demand for many years, as had many of the other ancient volumes in the archive. This could mean that the cipher was linked to books that had also been forgotten. Perhaps someone who had access to the library in the past had used it as the perfect place to store their secrets, and that secret could now be revealed. Ben picked up the old library catalogs, courtesy of Mrs. Petty. He began to study them to see how the books had been arranged on the shelves in different years. The catalogs were old journals with records of each book, its location, and changes in inventory. Johnson knew the key to the cipher had to be among those entries. He flipped through the pages of the catalog, studying the shelves in the library's archives until one particular reference caught his attention. It was a small shelf in the far corner of the archive that held books related to history, philosophy, and espionage. These books were rare, and few Lakewood residents had ever been interested in them. However, they matched the time and subject matter. Perhaps they were the very books used to create the cipher. Johnson made quick notes and headed for the library. In the archives, he found the very shelf the catalog had mentioned. It was covered with a layer of dust, and the books looked like they hadn't been touched in a long time. Taking one of them off the shelf, he looked closely at the title. It was an old book on the history of espionage from the First World War. Then he pulled out another book and another. They were all related to the history of warfare, intelligence, and cryptography. These were the books that were most likely used as the key to the cipher. The detective returned to his desk with the books and the encrypted note. He now had everything he needed to start deciphering. He realized that each number in the message pointed to a specific page, line, and letter in those books. Following this logic, he began to analyze the order of the numbers in the note. The first line of the cipher began with the number 12. Ben opened one of the books and found the 12th page. He then noticed the symbol that followed the number. It was a symbol that looked like the letter L. He pointed to the 12th line on the page, and after checking all the letters, he realized that the symbol could stand for a letter from the line. The process was complicated and required incredible concentration. Johnson spent hours double-checking every letter and number until slowly but surely he began to put together a meaningful message from the disparate symbols. Finally, after hours of work, the first word began to emerge in front of him: fire. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't a random word. It carried a threat. He continued to decipher the text, and soon the full picture was revealed to him. The message hidden in the books contained the following: fire at town hall, distraction, bank robbery. The entire town of Lakewood was still peacefully settling into its usual measured rhythm when Detective Ben Johnson realized the threat that loomed over it. The message he had struggled so hard to decipher was more than just an encrypted riddle. It was a warning of a crime that was about to take place in the coming days. Johnson felt the tension building in his chest. Now he didn't have time for thinking or long analysis. Every minute counted. The message, hidden in old cryptography books, spoke of setting fire to the town hall. It was meant to be a distraction to keep the police and emergency services busy putting out the fire, while a group of criminals prepared a bank robbery on the other side of town. Johnson knew that a bank robbery was a serious crime that required careful planning, and the criminals who could devise such a cunning scheme were clearly not new to the business. Ben began to analyze the possible moves of the criminals. They were undoubtedly counting on the fact that all the police of the town would be distracted by the fire in the town hall, and taking advantage of the commotion would rob the bank. But when was this to take place? That was the big question. Although there was no exact date in the message, Johnson assumed that the crime must take place very soon. The arson and the robbery had to be coordinated, which meant that the time between them was minimal. Another important clue was the fact that the criminals were obviously aware of the peculiarities of the local police force. Lakewood was a small town, and its police force was not numerous. During a large-scale event, such as the town hall fire, most of the police force would surely be dispatched to the scene of the fire. This left the bank defenseless, and criminals could pull off a robbery unimpeded. Ben realized that action had to be taken immediately. He headed for the office of Lakewood's police chief, Michael O'Connor. O'Connor was an old-school man with a lot of experience, and he was well aware that despite the quiet life in the city, such threats could not be underestimated. "Michael, we have a problem," Johnson said, barely entering the chief's office. O'Connor looked at him in surprise, looking up from the papers on his desk. "Problem? Tell me what happened." Johnson summarized what he'd learned. He told of the encrypted message found in the library, of his investigation, and finally of the fact that the decryption pointed to the burning of the town hall and the subsequent bank robbery. With each word, O'Connor's face grew more and more serious. "If you're right," he said, pressing his lips together, "we don't have much time. The criminals may already be ready to act." "That's right," Johnson nodded. "We need to organize security for both the town hall and the bank as soon as possible. I'm sure they'll try to act at the same time to distract the police." Ben gathered all the key police and fire officials at the main office. Police Chief Michael O'Connor opened the meeting by outlining the main objective. "We are dealing with a well-organized group of criminals who are going to commit two crimes at the same time. Their plan is to distract the police with an arson attack on City Hall while robbing a bank. We need to not only prevent the arson, but also capture those who will be doing the robbery. All eyes were on Ben, who looked focused and confident as always. They know our attention will be on the town hall, Johnson began, pointing to a map of the town, so they're counting on that. We can't afford to let any of these crimes happen, but the main target is robbery. The fire department can handle the arson if it starts, but we need to keep the bank under constant surveillance. He pointed to the location of the town hall and the bank, which were at opposite ends of town. So, what do we know? Johnson continued. The criminals are counting on chaos. They think we'll throw everything we have at putting out the fire. But one thing they haven't taken into account is that we can split up our forces and control both locations at the same time. The detective has devised a plan whereby the police will operate on two fronts. The first team will be sent to the town hall. They'll keep a low profile on the building, waiting for a possible arsonist. A plainclothes team will patrol the area around the town hall, trying not to attract attention. I want to have one observer unit at City Hall, Johnson explained. We're not going to put all of our personnel there. Let the perpetrators think everything is going according to their plan. As soon as they act up, our team will step in and prevent the arson. Then he turned his gaze to the bank. The second group will guard the bank. Here I want more men, but without a show of force. Let the criminals think we have no one there. We'll set up an ambush. As soon as they start robbing, we'll take them out. Ben has assigned two of his best officers to coordinate these teams. O'Connor, nodding, added, "We'll also be ready to call for reinforcements if anything goes wrong. Don't forget that the criminals may try to change the plan if they feel threatened. We need to be ready for any surprises." Night fell, and the town of Lakewood seemed to be frozen in anticipation. The streets were quiet, with the distant sounds of cars and the footsteps of the occasional passerby. But in the police and in the minds of those involved in the operation, tension had reached a fever pitch. Detective Ben Johnson knew something would happen today that would change this city. The criminals had to act on this particular night. The police team, scattered around the two main locations, the town hall and the bank, was on full alert. Their task was clear: to prevent the criminals from realizing their plans. Plainclothes policemen, disguised as casual passersby, were on duty around the town hall. They tried not to draw attention to themselves, but were ready to intervene at any moment. There was nothing suspicious on the streets until now. Meanwhile, another group of police officers took up positions around the bank. Detective Johnson was particularly attentive to the place. The bank was an old building with solid walls and solid security, but the criminals clearly knew their way around the security system. Johnson assumed their main objective was to break into the old vault, which was rumored to hold large sums of money and securities. The clock showed it was nearly midnight when the first movement began. The message came from the watchers at the town hall. A suspicious figure dressed in all black appeared in the field of view of the cameras. The man moved quickly and cautiously, clearly trying not to draw attention to himself. In his hands he was carrying a suitcase, too big for an ordinary passerby. Johnson got the notice and immediately tensed up. The man approached the back entrance to the town hall. It was the kind of place that wasn't monitored by security cameras, so he felt relatively safe. He opened his suitcase, and inside were canisters of flammable liquid and several incendiary devices. The perpetrator acted confidently, but he was unaware that he was being watched. Johnson, watching through surveillance cameras, gave the command to the team of police officers on the ground. "Go ahead, but quietly, without making too much noise." The cops moved toward the perpetrator, surrounding him on all sides. They were so well prepared that the man didn't even realize what had happened. In a matter of seconds, he was disarmed and handcuffed. This was the first part of the criminals' plan, setting fire to the town hall, which they planned to use as a distraction. Johnson noted to himself with satisfaction that this part had been prevented quickly and quietly. But that was only the beginning. At the same time the arsonist was apprehended, Johnson received a message from the team watching the bank. There, on one of the back streets, a number of men had appeared, dressed similarly to the first offender. They were organized and acted quickly. One of them took out lock picks and began to pry open the door leading to the basement of the bank. This was the weakest point in the building's security system, and the criminals obviously knew it. Detective Johnson, realizing that this was the moment to act decisively, gave the next command. "We've been waiting for this moment. Everybody in position. Let's take them all the way." The police team at the bank was ready for any twist and turn. As soon as the criminals entered the basement, the team began to move. The police officers carefully descended the stairs so as not to make noise and give the criminals a chance to escape. It was dark inside the building, but their night equipment allowed them to see exactly what was going on. The criminals had already started to open the safe when they heard the first footsteps. Their ringleader, a man with a cold stare and confident movements, reacted quickly and tried to grab a gun. But the police were quicker. They surrounded the robbers, leaving them no chance. "Don't move," sounded the voice of one of the officers, and the criminals were caught by surprise, stopped. The criminals' eyes darted from the safe to the police, and the man in charge, realizing that the plan was falling apart, tried to make one last move. But Johnson was ready for that too. The criminals were apprehended without a single shot being fired. It all went so quickly that none of the robbers had time to realize how it had all happened. Johnson entered the room a few minutes after the arrest and saw the scene. 3 men, hands bound, sitting on the floor by the open safe. The robbers had succeeded in opening it, but they had not succeeded in taking out a single bill. It was an absolute defeat for the criminals. When all the criminals were apprehended and handcuffed, Johnson allowed himself a sigh of relief. The operation had gone flawlessly. He looked around the bank and asked a few questions of his men. It was just as they had suspected. The bank robbery was the main objective, and the burning of the town hall was just a diversion. But thanks to careful police work and coordination, both crimes were prevented. Johnson went outside where O'Connor and the other officers were waiting for him. "Good job," said the chief of police, shaking the detective's hand. "We got them." "We were one step away from disaster," Johnson replied, "but luckily we were able to foil their plan in time." He looked up at the sky, where the first rays of dawn were beginning to break. The town of Lakewood had been saved, and the criminals who had planned such an insidious act had been punished. After a night of tension and adrenaline, Lakewood awoke to a new day. The regular citizens of the town, not yet knowing what he had been through, were quietly going about their business. A crime had been averted, and thanks to the coordinated work of the police and Detective Ben Johnson, no one in town was hurt. But those close to the case were already realizing the danger they had escaped. Lakewood, with its calm and measured life, might have woken up to smoke and chaos if not for that chance find in the library. The morning began with an official briefing at the police station. Police Chief Michael O'Connor stood in front of a group of reporters, talking about the past operation. He proudly announced that the criminals had been apprehended and all their plans had been foiled. Thanks to the quick response of the police and the careful work of Detective Johnson, O'Connor said, "We were able not only to prevent the arson of the town hall, but also to arrest the robbers who had tried to rob the bank." Ben Johnson's name was often mentioned in conversations afterward. His analytical skills and ability to see deeper than superficial facts made him a hero again in the eyes of the town. But the detective himself remained modest. Only one thing was important to him. The case was closed and the town remained safe. Meanwhile, in the library, Mrs. Petty, who expected no fame, found herself the center of attention. Her simple discovery in an old book became the starting point for uncovering a complex conspiracy. Lakewood residents came to the library to express their gratitude and admiration for her. The local newspaper wrote an article entitled "Lakewood's Heroine," how a librarian saved the city, in which Mrs. Petty, with her attention to detail and love of books, was credited as the main reason the crime was averted. She wasn't used to such attention, but she gladly accepted the acknowledgments. However, she still kept busy with her work. After all, books and the library had always been her main occupation. A few days after the successful operation, Ben Johnson decided to stop by the Lakewood Library. He felt that there was one more important step left to take: to personally thank Mrs. Petty for her observation and attentiveness that had helped prevent the disaster. When he entered, Mrs. Petty was, as usual, at her desk, engrossed in reordering her books. She looked up when she saw Ben, and her face lit up with a warm smile. "Detective Johnson." With surprise, she exclaimed, rising from the table. "I'm so glad to see you. I hear everything went well." "Yes, Mrs. Petty, and I wanted to thank you personally," Ben said, approaching her. "If it hadn't been for your discovery, if you hadn't told us about the strange message, we might not have known about the criminal's plans. Thanks to you, Lakewood is safe." Mrs. Petty blushed and waved her hand, clearly embarrassed by the attention. "Oh, don't exaggerate, detective," she said modestly. "I just found a strange piece of paper. It was you who did all the hard work." "Perhaps," Ben smiled, "but you played your part. There was much more to that book than just a cipher. It was the key to saving our city. Knowledge and attention to detail is sometimes more important than it seems." They walked along the shelves of the library, and Ben involuntarily remembered how it had started. It had been an ordinary morning, unremarkable until that old book on cryptography had fallen into Mrs. Petty's hands. Who would have thought that such a seemingly boring thing would turn out to be connected to something so dangerous? Strolling through the library, Ben stopped involuntarily at the very shelf where the unfortunate book had been found. He looked at it with interest and felt a slight nostalgia. There had been much louder and more dangerous cases in his practice, but this one was special. It had begun with a quiet old book and would now end just as quietly. "You know, Mrs. Petty," Ben said thoughtfully, "I've always believed that answers can be found where you least expect them. And this case was proof of that. A chance find in a library was more important than anyone realized." "Libraries hold many secrets," Mrs. Petty said with a smile. "And sometimes those secrets are more important than the stories in the books." They exchanged warm words, and Ben felt that this chapter was finally closed. Mrs. Petty went back to her work, and Ben headed for the exit, feeling satisfied that the case was over and the town could return to its normal life. Lakewood was gradually returning to its usual rhythm. People were coming to the library again, discussing the news, borrowing books, and sharing stories. Many residents didn't even know how close they were to danger, and perhaps it was for the best. Ben Johnson realized that their peaceful lives were something they had to preserve. To him, this was just another case, another difficult puzzle to solve. But each time, cases like this reminded him how important details are, how important it is to cooperate with those who see what others may not. After all, knowledge and attention to detail are the tools that can prevent disasters. And the Lakewood Library, with its old books and attentive Mrs. Petty, played an invaluable role in this endeavor. The story ends on a positive note. The criminals were punished, the town was safe, and Mrs. Petty became a true heroine of Lakewood, though she remained a modest and dedicated librarian. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.